I know they'll probably cut some of this, hopefully, just so that you're aware. For those of you who don't know me as a trainer, I'm Nishe. I am one of the Animas trainers. I'm an integrative coach. I'm a supervisor and so forth, lots of different things. I'll give you a bit of information. We can find out more about me right at the end. So if you want to have a look, you're welcome to. In terms of the way I run sessions, I tend to be very interactive. But those of you who've got your cameras off, that's fine. But please recognise that that's kind of how this is going to work. It's a bit of a workshop as opposed to me just talking at you. So I will be sharing information and giving us a bit of springboards for conversation. But actually, this is just about bringing your ideas, your perspectives, and let's see where we end up together. So just that we're super clear. And just make sure you're in the right place. You'll see me looking down every so often because I'm working off my slides on my iPad. And here we go. So I'm assuming this is what you've signed up to. So shaping the boundaries and the scope of coaching for the future. It's a really big title that I'm hoping we'll live up to as we go through. But essentially what we're going to be doing over the next 70, 80 odd minutes is just really taking a beautiful view over the transformative coaching space and starting to look at how this system operates, what it's like, and I'm going to build that out layer by layer as we go along. Okay, so as we go through this, what I'll do is I'll keep adding detail, invite you to add detail, and then once we've expanded, I do apologize, we're really going to go out there a little bit. I'm going to invite you to see where you might sit as part of that and see what role you play within the transformative coaching space. So that sound okay? All right, so those of you just joined us, just a heads up that we're going to dive into this. It's a workshop. We'd love to see your faces, would love to hear you participate. Let's see where we end up. Okay. So just to give you a sense of what I'm like, if you haven't spent any time with me, I like to play patterns, and that's kind of what I'm going to be doing in this space. Is we're going to discover patterns that operate within the coaching space. I like to work at my edge, which means this is going to be hugely exploratory and us really starting to push the edge of our understanding and what else could be happening in the coaching system. And then finally, I love to learn, which means I'm coming into this going, hey, this is a perspective. This is how I'm seeing it currently, but I truly welcome you to help form that further and to challenge a bit of my thinking and encourage me to learn along the way as well. All good? It's participatory. We're going to have a great conversation, hopefully. Lots of questions, lots of thinking, exploring, just so that we're super clear here. If you don't participate, I've got about 30 minutes of content at the top end. So you're either going to have a really long lunch break or we're going to get into a really great conversation. Don't know where we'll end up with it, but that's kind of how this is set up. So I'm going to be led by you in part with this. We've got a good frame, and then we'll bring in your perspectives. So let's start with a little bit of defining what we're working with before we dive into it. So taking a simple definition of a system as a group of interacting, interrelated elements that act according to a set of rules to create a unified whole. So lots of different parts that come together in some way. And when you look at the whole thing, you're looking at one element, and that's the system. And so one of the simplest systems that we're probably all aware of is our solar system, right? To give us a bit of a frame. So we have the sun at the center, planets around it. So each planet is a different element. The sun's a different element. They interrelate and interact. Then you start expanding outwards. You get asteroids, you get comets, you get your stars, and you start building out your galaxy made of multiple solar systems and then multiple galaxies into the universe. So what you have is systems within systems. Does that make sense? And some will overlap and interrelate. So the Earth in itself is a system in its own right, and it forms part of the solar system. So these kinds of things happen as we go along. All good with that definition? Okay, I'm just going to drop a few bits of information first. Then we have transformative coaching, and I'm going to take my lead from Nick Bolton and how he defines it, but I'm going to interpret it. So I'm going to give you my interpretation of it as I see it currently. So we have the phenomenological experience, our experience of the world around us. So the client's experience as well, sitting very much at the heart of this and forming that central ring. Then we have this middle ring, and that's made of 3 elements: the psychological, humanistic, and holistic systemic. So the psychological are essentially the lenses through which we can see the world and helps us relate to the world around us. The humanistic, essentially, our internal drive to self-actualize, so our internal drive to become all we can be and to reach our purpose. And the holistics, reach our potential, and the holistic systemic, which is essentially all these different factors that start to support or hinder us on our journey towards that self-actualization. Okay, so those are those different elements. And then on the outer ring, you have this integrative piece, and this is the piece that holds it all together and supports all those different elements to work together. Still with me? Any questions so far? We're all good. Oh, sorry, go for it.
Before yeah.
Yeah, I know.
Can you just re-go over that one?
The phenomenological is essentially our lived experience. It's how we experience life. So it's what happens to us as a person. Yeah, cool. So I know I had to look that up. Like, I can now say it, but it was a bit of a struggle, a bit of a mouthful. Okay, so we've got what a system is, we've got what transformative coaching is. Let's bring it together. So when we start looking at the system of coaching, the phenomenological element can be considered our internal system of experience, our own paradigm. So most people be familiar with the iceberg model and all of those things that we experience as part of it. So it's not just what's below the surface, but it's the whole iceberg. And it's not just those different elements, it's how they interrelate and work together. That's the system bit of it, right? So knowing that our beliefs impact our values might impact our thinking, it all works together as a holistic whole. So that's the phenomenological bit. Then we move on and we think about the psychological bit. And what we can do when we think about coaching system is think about these as different lenses, the frames, the structures that influence how we see the world. So as we go through this as coaches, what we might do is develop this psychodynamic perspective, which allows us to consider the influences of the past or what's happening in the inner selves and the inner world part of what we do. We might take a behavioral perspective of this happens, therefore it creates this behavior. Or the cognitive bit, which is like this happens, we have some thinking in between, and then we then have a behavior afterwards. All these different ways of thinking about the world and seeing them, and that's just the psychological frames and lenses, right? There are lots of different things that we experience in life that help create a frame or perspective that we then see the world through. So our thinking on what it is to be human, the biological knowledge that we have of our nervous system and how the body works and how it all links together, that still forms part of the lens through which we think and we operate and we see the world. Still with me? Okay, there's more thinking going on. I'll slow us down in a second. Then what we have is the humanistic bit. So for me, when I think about this, when we start putting a systemic frame on it, it's the conditions and the components that support our journey to self-actualize. So it's not just the internal drive, that's when we think about just transformative coaching, but when we think about system, we start to think about the space we create, the environment we operate in, the time that we offer. all of these elements can support someone to reach their potential. So it's how we hold that person as they go on this journey. So for me, that's what humanistic looks like. And remembering this is just my perspective at this point. And then let's add the last one. So the holistic and systemic are all these different factors that start to influence the experience. So these are the things that we don't necessarily consider as part of coaching. We might go, oh, that's something external. But when we start looking at a broader perspective, a person's experience of work can influence their experience within the coaching space, how they see themselves and how they relate to external parts like their family and friends and money and so forth. All of these things can start influencing them as a person. And you'll notice that rather than having concentric rings, I've started overlapping them. Because for me, it's this ebb and flow between all these different elements. Okay. How are we doing? I love that you're accepting all of this at the moment. Just go wait and see for you to challenge me on this. Okay. I've left the integrative piece out for now because that we're going to add that in a little bit. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to get you having a conversation about this first, because it'll be interesting to see what you might put into these different spaces. So we're going to probably do a couple of rooms and give you a good 15 minutes on this and see how you get on. But essentially what I'd like you to do is to take each of those different elements and consider what you would have, what would you place within those different parts. So with the holistic systemic, like you've got some examples there. What do you feel makes that up in terms of the system of coaching? What else is a part of this that we haven't yet touched on? Does that make sense? Kate, go for it.
Hi, sorry, I had to find the unmute button. Just before we do that, can I just ask, I don't know whether, I'm just seeing a lot of overlap between particularly humanistic and holistic and systemic. Like when I look at the examples that have been given, talk about connection to others, and then in holistic, it talks about family and work, which I would say is connection to others, external resources, and then it talks about wealth. And I would say that those are quite similar. So I'm just wondering what's the difference between the two?
And I think that's part of it. Depending on how you interpret it, you could place it either or within that overlap. So some things will sit within the overlap. So let me give you a classic example of something like IT technology, right? We've got constantly this evolving technology going on, right? So most people go, technology is holistic systemic. It's what influences how we operate, in theory. But in terms of the humanistic side of it, technology allows us to connect. It supports people to access the coaching and to interact. So being able to use Zoom, being able to use text, these types of technologies allow us to actually create the conditions that would support people on a journey. And the psychological side of it, in theory, you've got people who grew up without technology, who got connected to technology really late in their lives, and you've got people who grew up with technology intrinsically a part of their lives. So it evolved their thinking and how they saw things. Does that make sense? So a single element could sit in one part, but it could also sit in multiple parts depending on how we interpret it. And that's kind of where I want your thinking to go. I was kind of thinking we'd go there gradually, but if that's where you're at, let's go there. And I think that's what I want you to talk about, is if you take different things that you feel are part of the coaching system, where might you place them? How might they operate from those positions? and this is just the start of our conversation, right? We're just getting going and we're going to keep evolving this. Is that okay, Kate? Like, does that make sense? Okay, cool. Okay, so I'm going to pause us there. You came back, which is great. Okay, so let's have a, what types of things did you come up with and where would you place them?
We didn't really. We got onto a very different conversation about where a change would start. I think it was Kate within our group kind of came up with talking about religion and actually kind of how that would be an experience. And we got onto a very philosophical, complete different conversation, which was brilliant.
Okay.
But we definitely probably didn't do the circles. in a very tight format.
That's
I don't
fine.
know, that was my take of the group. I'll leave the rest of the group to say what they thought.
This is what I love about these sessions. Okay, let's see. What did you determine through that conversation? And sorry, I feel like you've just ended up in the spotlight, but hopefully the rest of your group will come in a second as well.
If anyone else wants to come in first. No, I'll go. What did we determine? Well, I think for me, it was very much, it is so interlinked with, it's hard to kind of form a boundary on all those three circles. Those three circles look very neat and nicely kind of put together, but actually they're so intermingled that actually trying to define them is really difficult.
Okay, that's really interesting because that's what so many people do, right, in coaching, is they take an idea or concept that is complex and then they drill it down to very simple ideas to be able to convey to someone else for them to be able to get it. But the whole thing can't be part of it because otherwise you just never get the core idea across. And so even if you think about what you learn in coaching and what you do as coaches, it's a distilled version of what's really going on. On that note, we're just going to add a few more theories and let's see what others are saying. And then before we go completely down a different route, Natalie, go for it.
So I feel like what we all said at the end is that it's all very fluid, as Sarah just started to say. It's just it looks very neat and it looks like it has a structure, but that probably doesn't happen in real life. And we looked at an example with this finding religion in life, which just came up. And if that happens, some of us was saying, oh, that would be like an internal change you have, and then that just kind of filters through to be more and more external till it kind of reaches the end of the ring and goes to the holistic bit. And then some of us, I was thinking, for me, it's always got to be an external trigger, and then the change goes to the inside. And towards the end, we said, really, but maybe there's no structure to it. Maybe it's quite fluid, and one always influences the other, the internal and the external. And you can't work one way through it. It's just all part of it.
So it's a very dynamic space.
Yeah, very dynamic, very fluid, and just very dependent on how things happen for a person.
Yeah. And yeah, you're all just stealing my thunder for later on, really, because we're going to end up here. We've just gotten here really early on, because it is a dynamic space, right? It doesn't matter how you look at it. We might place religion in an internal or, say, a holistic space and cozy, and we have this almost flowing that way. But I know the first time I was truly exposed to religion was actually for religious studies at school. And for me, that became a lens and a perspective to look through. So my true first introduction, and I say that, but we had prayer at primary school, right? So I was introduced to it in this holistic systemic. So I'm going, it's the first time I really engaged with it was from a psychological perspective, but actually it was inherently brought into my world because of school, rather than actually participating and engaging with religion. And so this then starts to create a formation of who the person becomes and their experience of the world as well. I feel like I'm just taking you off and giving you random things to talk about, but let's just keep going just a little bit further. Jacqueline, go for it.
Well, I was going to say, I'm happy to hold these thoughts a little bit too, if you want to, because again, we had a really fruitful conversation, but not necessarily within the kind of realm that you had been planning on. So I'm happy to hold on to it if you want to.
No,
go.
I kind of there going like this. I get the feeling this isn't going to end up on YouTube, but I think because you can't predict how these sessions go, and I can sit here and go, look, this is what I thought we were going to do, and let's just do that. Or I go, well, actually, isn't that just a system at work? And that you're coming in and having other conversations, and well, maybe that's where our learning is meant to be. So let's do that. I'm going to put my slides. I've got some pretty slides, but you know, they're going off to the side. But let's have a good conversation about this and what this actually is, because as we go through this, as we start to get a better sense of how this system of coaching operates, it starts to impact what we do as coaches, and not just what we do as coaches within the system, how we influence it and what we end up going to explore in our own journeys. And so, yeah, add to it. Go for it. Let's see what you thought.
Okay. So I guess what we noticed, I suppose, right at the beginning of the conversation was that we were bringing with us naturally some just like different definitions or just different kind of comprehension of those interconnected circles.
Yeah.
And even hearing, you know, I had the impression that those circles were like useful elements of transformative coaching that we could like use when we're thinking about a coachee and or we're thinking about like a, you know, someone's experience in being coached. I didn't have in my mind, like, I guess, external to internal or internal to external when we talk about like, I guess, a locus of change or like where a point of change would kind of start. And I didn't think about an experience progressing through those circles. I really thought of it as like elements, very like overlapping elements of the coaching experience. So that was just as an example that even having that conversation, we as a group, we almost had to reestablish where and take a couple steps back as to like where we could start as a common starting ground, because we were both coming into it, the topic from different places and different definitions, that it was almost like, well, one, we probably needed some more time, which is fine. But one, we had to like, we almost had to find a common ground. And you know what, we didn't really, because I definitely don't, I realized like, whoa, I actually don't think of change from a human being. I mean, I think that there's something with like action and perception.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's this, it's like part of this model, I guess, of like ecological skill acquisition, which is a big phrase. But anyway, I've heard of it a little bit, and that actually you can't necessarily distinguish what comes first. Like we are so intricately on like the neurological level, we're acting and perceiving at the same time, kind of. So I hadn't even thought of like, but I guess I take the stance that change is always internal, not necessarily external in. So anyway, just to say, and I won't talk too much longer, but just to say that that's kind of, it was an interesting group experience to have that. So
okay, what is the transformative coaching system then? if we take those concentric circles, those circles, we put them to a side and we just go, what is this thing that we are a part of? What is that?
The one thing that comes to me is that I'm trying to think in terms of those kind of, when you talked about the solar system, different planets, there's kind of in a very neat box kind of way, I guess, there's the client as one, as kind of us as another in terms of our experiences perceived, and maybe this is being very literal in the sense, but there's then the animas learning, and then the wider kind of solar system is actually all of the kind of wider learning that there is in terms of psychology, in terms of books that you've read, in terms of all that kind of how that impacts. But that's way too simplified. That doesn't quite, it feels to try and put that, the coaching system, to try and define it in that sense, actually now talking through it and thinking how big a solar system is, it does feel like that size of it, in the sense of actually there is so much that can impact upon an individual, impact upon both the coach and the client, and how they end up where they end up, that to try and define it in that sense actually feels very trivial, actually, I guess.
So what if we stepped out of the real world and we moved into a more metaphorical world, right? What is the system of coaching like?
I honestly have no clue. I'm going to need someone else to answer that one.
Okay.
I wonder whether it's, I don't know whether I can take it out metaphorically like you're asking. I think I'm probably still being a bit literal, but I think it's maybe on a sort of individual level, or with the client or with yourself, or, is recognizing maybe and getting to know yourself a little bit more, and understanding that you're not as simple as maybe you thought you were. Like, I think just in this conversation that we had, we were like, oh, well, there's this, and this is connected to this, and there's the internal to the external to the internal. And I think you can maybe go through quite a lot of life thinking, well, I'm this person, and this is what I believe, and this is my family, and this is where I went to school, and this is how I am, and not necessarily fully reflecting on or understanding how many different layers there are to you, to your relationships, to where you've come from, to where you're going, to why you are how you are, to questioning why you are and whether you want to be that or whether you want to be something different. And maybe just part of the process is looking at all those different circles, looking at how they connect, where they disconnect, which one comes first and where, and understanding just a bit more of an in-depth sense of who you are and why you're that and where you want to go.
It's really interesting because as you're speaking, and this is my interpretation, and not to simplify, but in my head, I'm going, that's the phenomenological bit. That's the experience bit. And that's your interpretation internally. And that for me becomes one bit of this. And it's often the bit that we do in coaching is we work with that. And I'm sort of there going, well, if we start to really appreciate the transformative coaching space and what everything that's part of it, perhaps that can expand what we do as coaches and our perspectives and the work we do with our clients as well, and bring about change in different ways when it's not just about person. And this is kind of like pushing the boundaries of what coaching is, right? Because we often use those lenses, but we don't dive into those things as much at the moment. Tim, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, that's a perfect segue. I'm afraid I'm not going to attempt to get towards the metaphorical definition either, but that kind of mirrors a conversation we were having in our group, which was around actually that framework just being really useful to check in with, reflect on ourselves and our coaching clients as to where we've spent, where the client's drawn to in that, in those circles. Do we spend all of our time with a particular client in one of those? Should we actually be trying to help them get into some of those other elements of their life? And we had a kind of good discussion around the potential utility of that, but also the kind of reflection back on our own coaching style, whether we're particularly drawn to one aspect of that, or whether you know, how we can use that to be better, more rounded coaches. And I'm afraid I have to drop off in a moment, so I was really glad I got the opportunity to speak and to say thank you. Hugely interesting session and very thought-provoking, but apologies, I've got that I need to dash to.
Great. Thank you for sharing, Tim. Thank you so much. And I think there's so here's the thing with the coaching bit of it is, we as coaches and our own development as coaches is influenced through this frame as well, right? So the psychological lenses we have, what we see as self, like reaching potential, what we see as these different elements are based on our experiences, but also what we're taught and what we're shown. And those can be biased as well. Did I just take something away there, Natalie, or was there something else? Go for it.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that I feel like the whole coaching space is obviously mainly about the outcome for your coachee, but as you were just saying, it's like, how does that influence me? Because I feel like I constantly change as a coach, and then like after a session like today, you kind of feel a bit like, oh, I've been really working on this, and now it's really, it's been brought to my attention that really I need to make sure that I focus on other things. And then often that brings a shift about where you then maybe even focus too much on another thing. And then with time, you just develop as a coach and you bring these things more and more together. And so, yeah, similar to what you were just going to say, how it works in the client, but also how it works in you. And then that makes the experience, it changes the experience constantly for everyone.
And I guess this is another thing about systems thinking, right? We can go, the system is this. And like, I know that's where I started us and kind of going, hey, what is this and what are we trying to create here? But inherently, as soon as we can see the system, we become a part of it. And so in what you're saying there, I'm sort of there going, well, wait a second. We're within it, we're influencing the client, we're experiencing developing within the system, but we're also able to step out of it, to observe it and to influence it. It's a fascinating role that we play as coaches, in my mind anyway. Sarah, go for it.
So I've just been kind of pondering in my head, kind of listening to the conversations, and very much that word boundaries. You know, kind of the scope of coaching, and just in my head I've kind of been going, is there a scope? Is there anything that's off limits? Is there a boundary? Because the conversation goes where the conversation goes. There isn't necessarily a boundary to be put in place depending on a kind of skill. And I know kind of getting into different areas in terms of if you're someone's comfortable with that. But with that word boundaries, I was just kind of going, well, is there any? Because if we're coaching someone and that's where they want to go, do we put boundaries on ourselves because we kind of go, this is the action they're looking for, that's where we must focus, and therefore only focus on X, but actually the scope and the boundaries are limitless? That might be quite a theoretical idea, but it's just that word boundary suddenly kind of, it just made me go, are there any boundaries? Or particularly for me, you know, do I focus on, I must coach this part of it because that's the action, we shall go there, and actually that's putting me on the outcome in a very uncoaching way.
I don't know if it's an uncoaching way, but it's where we often start. And when I think about coaching and the boundaries of coaching, I'm very challenged by this myself. And part of what's challenged me is the exploration of things outside of what I would term as coaching, right? So the exploration of things like time as concept. And I think Simon sort of nodded to this a little bit, but like, it's a human construct. Time exists within us. The past is a part of who we are. The future is what we become. It's not an external thing that we walk along. So if before I used a boundary, what is coaching, what is therapy along the timeline, and if I then go, well, the timeline is just our experience of life, and we're always working with the present in coaching. When am I not coaching? When am I actually stepping into therapy? So boundaries around modalities is an interesting one as well.
I think that's where I was trying to get to, in the sense of actually what's the line between, yes, I know it's not therapy and I know it's not mentoring and it's not, but that theoretical line, you know, in terms of very much future focus, but as you say, kind of the past impacts who you are and who you will be. So not to, you know, kind of say you can't focus on the past, but actually the past impacts your future.
And this is okay. And so this is where it starts getting really controversial, right? Because I start going, well, who says I can't work with the past? Who defined that? What, someone back in the last century went, oh, this is therapy, you can't do this unless you go through this training. Like, were they just really great marketing or something? You know, you sort of like, and that's where that thinking and the pushing of the boundaries starts happening, right? Because you sort of go, and this is not to knock people with great therapeutic skill and all this training, because they will have knowledge and experience that I don't have. But what says that knowledge and experience means that they're the ones that should work with these people and these concepts and these things? And again, I'm not saying this, please don't think this is like, oh, because you're a coach, go ahead and do it all. Like, there's boundaries around what we have the skill set and the knowledge to work with. But why do certain challenges for a human sit within certain modalities? Who defined that? Where's that coming from? Jacqueline.
I guess a boundary that I hadn't really realized. Well, I guess, you know, I'm obviously like a coach in training, or maybe that's not obvious. I guess people in the summit are certified as well. So anyway, yes, I've done the four modules so far. But when I have been meeting with practice coachees, and inherently this question will come up in some way, you know, with about, you know, half of them, about what is the difference between this and therapy. And they have thought or brought their own interpretation as part of the question. And sometimes you do hear time. And that doesn't really resonate with me because it feels like kind of what you've just said. I don't know, past, present, and future self, especially in terms of self. It feels like time isn't very a clean cut boundary. As far as modality is, it doesn't necessarily, you know, I obviously wouldn't be, it seems like a pretty obvious assumption that I'm not going to be bringing a modality to as an intervention if I haven't had exposure or training or experience with it. So there are some clear lines with like what Animus offers. There are training centers, right, that give, you know, cognitive behavioral coaching and stuff like that. So like that feels okay. But I suppose what has resonated with me more, and I probably will mispronounce this word, is the
phenomenological. So I know. But you just sort of go with it.
Yeah, it's strange. I like wish I had practiced that word more as like, I don't know, a younger person, because it's not sticking. It's not sticking with me. But phenomenological is really the lived experience of the coachee. That seems to be, I mean, and maybe, you know, this again is just because I'm in training and I don't have hundreds of hours under my belt, but having experienced a psychotherapy and coaching myself, both, it really felt like well, I guess there it is. There's my assumption, because it was my lived experience of both that helped me distinguish between the two, because they were two very different lived experiences from that lens or that system, whereas there was a lot of overlap in the other systems. Oh, that was interesting. Mm-hmm.
You just went somewhere, which is great. This is what this is all about, right? And this is where I really wanted this session, is to push the boundaries on how you think about coaching and think about what it is that you do. Because had you had a different couple of people that you worked with, they might have felt very similar. So I often get commentary from clients going, oh, that was a great counseling session. I'm like, I am definitely not a counselor. Like I'm not trained in that, but their lived experience felt very similar to what they'd had elsewhere. And who am I to say that I'm not offering them that? Now, I'm not saying that I'm a counselor, I don't have that training, but I can offer them an experience that supports them. And it's a really fascinating thing, because as coaches, so much of what we learn and develop from is taken from other disciplines. So we take so much of ours from psychology and therapeutic practice. That's a lot of the grounding. There's very, in my opinion, and that's because I haven't explored it enough, there's very limited work that's built on specifically on coaching. It's based on behavioral sciences. It's based on IT, tech, and systemic thinking. That's tech side of things, right? The arts. There's just so much that we pull from other places in coaching that's possibly why we're challenged with defining what the coaching system is because in and of its own right, it's not just one thing. In my opinion, again, I'm just chucking out in my opinion here. Natalie.
I think that all of these things, especially what you just said at the end, also rings really true. And for me, then the boundary or the line that I draw comes back to my client is, I can't remember the three things: resourceful,
creative, resourceful, and whole.
Yeah. And I think that for me, that is it's like the main, like whatever you want to call it, the headline of it. Mm-hmm. Because coming from that place, it means that I will not give advice. I will not tell someone what to do. I will not do all of the other things that might be part of other disciplines. Holding that really closely, I feel like whatever comes up, I will support the client in finding what everything they already have, and not even having to point them, but just helping them to go to that right place that is right for them. And I think, and I think one of the boundaries as well is you always, you end up having ideas or things that you think this is where it's going to go, and just happily being surprised by where it goes, and that reminding me that it's not my journey and it's not me who's mapping out a journey. And I think this is, for me, is the big difference. Whereas if I was in counseling, and I've also personally experienced that, if I was in counseling or was seeing a mentor, I would expect and want active advice and guiding.
Okay. Let's see if I can bring a little bit of challenge into this one. Okay. So say if you take this session, right? It feels like we can go, I'm treating you as creative, resourceful, and whole. I'm inviting your perspectives in and so forth. And I could just go, oh yeah, that's a great idea. Let's hear the next one. Let's hear the next one. You'll figure this out and you'll work through it. However, by bringing in little bits of information, a little perspective, shining a bit of light, I wonder if you sort of zoom out of it, if I hadn't done those things, where would you be now? Like, I know it's hard to imagine, but if I'm not sort of going, well, what about this and what about that, and pointing out things, then people would maintain their perspectives, and they could.
I think you'd absolutely do, and you have to, and you challenge, and you kind of bring yourself in there, but not with a mapped out way of, I think this will be good for you, and I think this is where we need to go. I feel like this comes like partly intuitively and partly with experience, that you do ask the questions, you challenge, and you in a way you kind of, you know, I try and stay away from the word guide, but you do guide. But then quite a lot what happens to me, for example, is that I would ask a question and then the client might ask back, oh, so do you mean this or do you mean that? And I'm like, oh, I don't know, where did your mind take you with that question? And that's interesting. And I don't ask or guide in a way that, oh, this is where I want to go with this, and this is what's going to help you.
And I hear you, but what I've started doing is saying to my client, this is what I think, and this is where I'd like us to go, and this is what I feel could be useful. What do you think? And I'm not saying that's what you need to do, right? I'm just saying, like, that's another approach that still sits within this. And I'm learning now, because I used to hide that. That'd be like, oh, we'll just explore this. It would happen in a hidden way. Now I'm bringing it more into the space to create a greater level of choice for my clients.
Yeah, but it's a choice. You wouldn't go in there having made up your plan, as in, okay, I figured that, and I feel like that's the flexibility that you have more in the coaching space, and I feel like you have that flexibility and you have that communication on eye level, where in other disciplines you wouldn't have that. The person would come into a counseling session or something else from a different perspective. They would probably come in more from, okay, I'm here to seek something, and the counselor would, or the mentor, or in any other context, would be more of the senior person and would be a bit more, yeah, I hear you, but I think we should go that way. And that's something I would never do in coaching.
And I think some of that is about the transformative coaching system.
Yeah.
Because we don't fixate on one particular way of operating, one way of doing, it is inherently built in that there are all these different things and different approaches and different ways of being, and they become a part of how we operate. If you had been taught or you trained in a very traditionalist approach, you might have a very different way of approaching it. And so I think that's the uniqueness of the transformative bit, is that there's no attachment to one way. And that's the integrative piece. It's this ability to move between lots of different ways, connect things together, that can be missing from individuals or coaches or practitioners who go, this is the challenge, this is the approach. Whereas with transformative coaching, this is a challenge. What are the different bits of that challenge? What's going on here? What are all the different approaches that we could do? And let's try and see where we end up. And it's sort of, that's why for me, those concentric circles, they don't quite work, because it's all happening at the same time. I don't know if that's aligning now. You're smiling, so I'm going to take that. We've got some, okay. I'm conscious of our time. Now, let's have another 5 minutes of this, but I would like you to have one more conversation, because I want to see what you're going to do with this later on. Kate, go for it.
I feel bad now. I don't want to take up the time if we want to move on. I just had a question. I was just wondering, so I'm just very briefly, I haven't even started training yet. I'm about to go into it. So I'm very, very much further behind and not knowing anything really. But I was just sort of wondering, when we were talking about that and the system and who defines that system and what the boundaries should be, I got a sense of a little bit of frustration on the system and where those boundaries are, which I can totally understand. And I was just sort of interested when you're saying that you've sort of moved more recently towards leading or suggesting and things, and maybe being less passive. I was just sort of, from your own personal experience, why you moved more towards that, and what changes have you noticed in the sessions that you've had, or the depth that you've been able to reach, or your own fulfillment, I don't know, of anything, into when you've moved more towards that approach?
I think it's, and this is very much just me and my experience, right? So I know that's what you're asking for. So I was very held in the way I coached. I had very clear boundaries. You're the client, I'm the coach. I did this, you did that, you know. And a lot of that came from wanting to replicate what other people did and what I saw as good coaching. Over time, my definition of quality coaching has shifted and changed, and there's more in this space. But what I now recognize is it's not coach-client, it's partnership. And I'm sort of there going, how do I be your partner if I'm just sat not, if I'm just on here and you're doing all the work? And we often talk about that. We're like, the client does the work, but I'm like, they're going, but I'm their partner. So my role, I see coaching slightly differently now. It's not just about eliciting it from the client, but it's offering the client and encouraging their their exploration towards their goal. No question, it's about what they want. But the difference it's made is that the relationship has become stronger. The level of trust has deepened, in my perspective, and the willingness for my clients to receive things, questions, observations, so forth, has become stronger. It's become better. They're more open to it. Which, when I take something like the modality of NLP and hypnosis and hypnotic language and the messaging I can provide through that to unlock things, people go, well, that's manipulative. And I'm like, I'm just giving a perspective and offering it. Like, is that wrong? And please don't get me wrong, I still question and challenge myself on this. I'm constantly going, how far is too far? But some would say it's just a perspective. Others would say I'm influencing too much. But the relationship allows it to be received and for the client to choose. So my clients feel like they can disagree with me, that they can have a different perspective, and I build that within it, and I actively work on that. But I don't feel I could do that. I don't think I could have that kind of relationship if I didn't work in partnership and I wasn't in the space with them. And let's be clear, that's how I see it now. Talk to me another year's time, it could be different. And yeah, it's the relationship that's been the biggest change. Module 3, by the way, just so you know. Okay. Jacqueline, very quickly, and then we'll just get in groups.
Yeah, just a quick question there. So were you saying that as you have evolved as a coach into like present day, that you find yourself kind of intentionally, as you said earlier to Natalie, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, that you find yourself saying things, with intention, using the word I think there could be value in going here. What do you think? Or I'm seeing this or sensing this. What do you think? So there's more of that currently. Is that in addition to the work you do with NLP and like hypnotherapy or hypno coaching? Or because you were saying that what you've noticed is a strengthening of the relationship and deeper trust and rapport that almost has, of course, then enabled the client to go deeper and go in a different way because you're in the space with them. So I'm kind of just guessing that those are those coaching sessions, as opposed to, would an NLP or a hypno coaching session be just a different structure, like not as much like talking and give and take? Is that correct? Or
it's all the same for me.
Oh.
That's the integrative piece. That's
Okay.
the different psychological perspectives. That is the different influences of systems and so forth, right? I don't suddenly go, right, now I'm going to use hypnotic language.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. Okay.
Right? It's just inherently within me. Now, I can very much step back and go, right, these are things I did, and that was the value of them and so forth, and I can reflect on that. But in the moment, I'm responding to my client based on everything that I have.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I did really kind of think that NLP or like is it hypnotherapy? Is that what it's called?
Yeah. So
Yeah. I kind of saw those things as like separate, like this will be this session versus this session, but that's very interesting. Yeah. Really taking the word integrative to its max, kind of. Yeah.
And this is what that transformative coaching really is about, is that it's understanding and recognizing different component bits We're not necessarily going, it's this, like these are different, this is how it sits. So that's the bit that we're all there going, well, we don't know quite where it sits, but we recognize different components and we can move between them, or we can combine them, or we can utilize them in any which way to support the person in front of us. Marta.
Yeah. I just had, it sounds like I coach in a very similar way. And I believe I've had this conversation with you months ago, and it kind of shifted my perspective as well. So thank you for that. But I would say that contracting then comes in very importantly in that partnership, because you then need to make sure that the client knows that they can disagree with you and that we don't have to go where I want to go. And if I suggest something, then I have to take it. And so it's this idea that they are just, equal, and when you really have that equal partnership, and yeah, they are creative and whole and whatever the other thing is. Sorry, I never know. Yeah.
But it's really interesting. So you're all going with this, and you're engaging with this in some ways. But I also recognize that there are coaches out there who would very much disagree with that, and who will point out that there is inherently, and I know this, inherently within coaching, there is an imbalance of power. And so clients, coachees will pretty much on every occasion place the coach in a higher position because they've come to us for support. And so part of that relational piece of work is about leveling that. And that's an ongoing piece and a recontracting around the relationship. But it is part of coaching, is that we have huge influence. Okay, not quite where I thought we'd end up today, but seems like it's been a useful conversation with you all. So, because of where we're at with timing, let me just offer this question to you as a group. If you think about how you see transformative coaching as a system, the way in which you currently see it, where would you place yourself as the coach?
In what sense?
This is where I work with coaches. So it would be great in my diagram, but how do you see yourself relating to the system of transformative coaching? Marta.
Yeah, I don't know if I understand your answer 100%, but the first thing that came to my mind was I came from a criminology and social change background, and I kind of going into social entrepreneurship. So I do work with survivors of violence, and that's what I've been doing for around 2 years. So I see myself as the more, I would say, in between the kind of humanistic and then the holistic systemic as a coach, because that kind of overall, that's my goal as a coach, is to eventually change society. But having said that, obviously the one-on-one work that I do is not only on that. So I do group coaching and individual coaching, and I have a community, and I have all of this project going on. And I do obviously the system. It's interesting because we're talking about the system almost like a linear thing, right? And we've kind of talked about blurring the boundaries and things, but actually there is this distinction, I think it was Karl Popper who said it, and between a clock system and a cloud system, where you have a clock system, it's very mechanical, linear. Something is broken, you can just go in there, find the broken piece, change it or fix it, and then everything will work as it should do again. In a cloud system, clouds are unpredictable and they change and morph into different things all the time. It might rain, it might not, they might bring thunderstorms or whatever. And I feel like the coaching system is very much that. It's very much a cloud system where we never know what might happen. We never know where the client is going. We never know, how we're going to show up, because if something happens in our life, that's probably going to show up too, as much as we try to live it outside. So we never really know what happens in the coaching space. So I think I would be like in the center of that system, bringing everything together in a very weird, unpredictable way. But if I have to give a more straightforward answer, I would say in the more kind of holistic, systemic side of things, that would be my coaching. I don't know if that made any sense.
Yeah, I love that you're trying to bring it back to this frame that I'm kind of there going, just kind of chucked out the window as well. But I love the idea, the concept of that cloud, right? Like it's constantly evolving, it's constantly changing, things are interacting in lots of different ways, that we're part of the cloud, but we can also hold the cloud as well in some ways. Okay. Did we go down we're going slightly philosophical, but that's where we're going. So what about others? Given the conversation we've had, how do you now relate to the system of coaching? Sarah. Oh, I can't hear you.
I was trying to think, no, that was me trying to figure out what was, it was a momentary pause. I think, I was thinking about it and I just think, I don't actually think I would class myself as sitting within a system, actually. I think I sit completely external of it. And yeah, kind of to utilize all those things. I like the idea Marta said of a cloud. It feels very much like you're kind of in this ether sometimes, and you're just everything you can utilize. And there are, to me, kind of more like different toolboxes that you can open and utilize at a moment's notice, rather than having a set, trying to, as I said at the beginning, trying to put yourself in a circle, in a system, in a label that doesn't feel right to kind of me in terms of it. I think if there is a system, I don't think I would class myself as necessarily sitting within it.
And that's really interesting, because I remember when I first got introduced to the concept of systems, the moment we interact with the system, we become a part of it, is what I was taught. So this is just another way of me starting to see how we could interact with it, right? Like there's no reason why that's the truth. And so perhaps it is just what you're saying, and seeing it from the outside, just being able to access it all. What about others? Kate.
Yeah, from my perspective of not having done any training yet, this has been super, super useful. So thank you, first of all. I think one of the things that's been really useful for me is that when I said something earlier and you quite rightly said, and I'm going to just let it roll off my tongue, that it was all very focused on the phenomenological part
right.
of, thank you, of it. And I think that's where at the moment, without any training and without any real knowledge of anything, that's sort of where I instinctively am sitting, and what I probably know, I suppose, because of my own lived experience. And so I do think it's just been a really enlightening opportunity for me to maybe go into it more open-minded and more aware of how many more aspects of it there are to it, and what Marta's talking about, and how fundamentally Marta wants to be able to have an impact on society and on issues. I think that's incredible, and I'd love to. I'm going to be stalking you, Marta, finding you on LinkedIn and all sorts of other things, because I'm really interested in the work that you're doing. And yeah, so it's just been quite an interesting. I don't know my answer to where I sit there, because at the moment I don't sit anywhere. But it's been a really interesting question, and a beginning of probably quite a long and convoluted thought process. So thank you.
Thank you for sharing, Kate. Peter, let's hear from you, and then I'll start to bring this to a close.
It's been like listening to the conversations as well, and I've been thinking about where I would sit. But to me, that's the first thing, and I think that when you ask the question, it's very fluid, because you kind of want to go into all spaces a little bit, but it all depends on how that conversation's going with that client. And sometimes, I mean, naturally I would be drawn towards like the holistic approach, because that's actually encompassing all the different elements of that individual and the things happening around them, and the humanistic approach as well. But then the psychological and all the other factors play a big factor, whether we realize it or not. And I wonder how conscious we are when we're going down a certain space or a route. Whether are we solely focusing on holistic, where now actually we're forgetting the other things that impact that conversation. And again, like it's really difficult, because sometimes I am learning how to offer that choice to that client, but sometimes when you're actually listening to what the client's saying, all these things pop up, and you have your own assumptions and you want to explore as well, but you have to come back to, this is what they wanted at the end of this session. So I just feel like it's very fluid, and every session is completely different. So I can't really pinpoint where I sit, but I think it's a helpful tool, but then you've got to be mindful of it as well, I think.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing. And I'm kind of like it's there to trigger your thinking in this, right? Like, I don't know if we do sit in one place, or we sit in multiple places, or we hold multiple places at the same time, or we're constantly moving, but it's almost irrelevant in that sense. It's kind of us going, now that we're starting to see the broader system of transformative coaching, we're starting to look at it, and we're starting to go, well, wait a second, how does this work, and what's it like, and what's going on here? It's about continuing that thinking, and that being part of the reflective practice in your growth, because you can switch it off now and go, right, I get this perspective, but as you grow, your perspective is going to change. And so for me, and when that happens, the system of coaching changes as well. So everyone who's part of it will influence its change. And so we can sit back and go, right, I know what coaching is, but for me, it's constantly evolving, because the world's constantly evolving and we, people, are constantly evolving. So I invite you to keep reflecting on this and keep exploring it, and to trust yourselves, because actually you don't have to just stay within the world of coaching for it to become a part of coaching. So following your own passions, the stuff outside, starts to influence who you are and how you show up with your clients. It's all still part of it, as far as I'm concerned, those extra influences. But anyway, do I give you? Okay. So I am going back to my slides just very quickly, because I feel it would be a shame not to give you this. So let's have a quick, I know we're right on time, so I'm going to share this and then we're going to go. So a couple of questions for you to take with you. So what do you want to continue to explore as part of the coaching system? So do you want to zoom into a part of the system, zoom out, map it further, explore what's missing? We haven't talked about everything. We've scratched the surface on this. So what do you want to continue exploring, if there's anything at all? And then what might you like to create, evolve, bring to the coaching system? Are these things that will you develop concepts and theories? Will you create a technique? Are there core structures of the system that you want to be a part of developing? For me, these are the things to explore. You've got the concept of the system. Now, what do you want to do with it? Let's stop the recording there.